All right, g'day. Welcome back to Collectivitis podcast, where we dissect the disease that is collectivism. My name's Pietro. We've got a returning guest today, someone who I find I increasingly struggle with how to introduce them. The first time I introduced them as a former young liberal, reformed criminal. The second time, spokesperson for libertarianism. The second time, he was the federal secretary of the Libertarian Party. Now he's the Senate candidate for the Libertarian Party, and a myriad other things which I'm sure I've forgotten. But that'll do from my side. I'll let him introduce the rest of the things that I've forgotten. Welcome back to the show, Jordan Dittloff. How are you?
Oh, good. Thanks, Pietro. I think I might, I don't know if this is an accolade or not, but I reckon I might take the title so far for most regularly appearing guest with the most shifting titles. Like you said, I think sometimes I get confused. Um, but yeah, look, it's still a bit surreal to be sitting here and to be introduced by someone I've known as long as I have you as the lead Senate candidate for Vic. Um, that was a process that took a reasonably long amount of time, but it was time well spent because it meant that we were ready to go out of the gates and we've sort of burst forth. And we're in week two. We're at the end of week two. So, and it feels like we've been campaigning for 2 months. I think, we've been sort of pretty out there and very much getting a lot done and undertaking a lot of activities within the party and externally, which I'll talk about later, I'm sure. But yeah, it's sort of finally starting to feel real. It's pretty exciting.
Yeah, I do want to talk about the campaign stuff later on. And for anyone who is tuning into the show and isn't particularly in tune with the politics of the Libertarian Party here in Australia, so Jordan has been announced as the Senate candidate only recently, which is a pretty big deal for the Libertarian Party because for us, or the Senate candidate in Victoria, because for us that is the most electable position come a federal election, and we had on the show just a couple of weeks ago former Senator David Leyonhjelm, who spoke about how that is kind of the role where the most leverage and the most libertarian-esque either platforming or actual policy can be made. So it's a big deal. It's a big deal whether who it is that's running for this position and whether we can actually manage to get them in. Uh, Now, the last time we had Jordan, not the last time, sorry, the first time we had Jordan on the show, we spoke about his, we spoke about your background and your past, and there's a whole story that goes along with it. And I mean that whole episode was dedicated just to your story, which went for over an hour. So I encourage, I'll put a link in the description for anyone who's interested in the full story. Although I will say that I just watched a couple of minutes before, and it was literally our third episode, so I cringed a little bit at how uncomfortable I looked in front of a camera still at that point. But for those for those who don't really want to go and look at an hour long, do you want to maybe give us the cliff notes of your story, of where you came from, how you went from a former young liberal and all the ups and downs up until where you are today?
Yeah, so I'll try to give the elevator pitch. So basically, I became involved in politics at quite a young age. I joined the Liberal Party at 21 and sort of threw myself into young Liberal politics. Alongside that, I purchased a business in Colac area of Victoria, which is a regional area about 2 hours southwest of Melbourne. And unfortunately, also alongside that, I was really struggling with some personal demons around drug and alcohol addiction as well. And that drug and alcohol addiction combined with the weight of having borrowed by the business and generally lack of business acumen and experience, and also just some lack of judgment, lack of maturity, wanting to run before I could walk. And, I recently saw, and we'll talk about this in a moment, I recently saw a picture of myself at that age when I had bought the business, when I was running the business, and I looked like a baby, like I was an infant. I think seeing that photo side by side me now gave me a lot more forgiveness to myself, because that's something that I've sometimes struggled with. Like I have sometimes been very hard on myself for the mistakes I made and really struggled to kind of understand and forgive those mistakes. Sometimes we're our own worst critics, and that's certainly been true of me. But looking at that photo side by side me today, of me at age, must have been 23, 24 in that photo, I just look at that kid and I think, what on earth were you doing? Like how did we think this was going to end? But how it did end was that my business failed under the weight of my business failures and my addiction, and I spent 27 months in prison. So that was for theft charges relating to my business failure, and clients borrowed money when the doors were closed, and also with respect to drug trafficking and possession offences that had sort of flowed from my addiction. So that's kind of it in 5 minutes in terms of what happened in my past. And what happened after that was I basically sort of dusted myself off and slowly kind of reconstituted myself while I was apart from society in prison. And I made some decisions about who I wanted to be and what I wanted to do after I got out. And I've set about achieving those things and being that person every day since.
Yeah, well, and again, the whole story we talked last time about, the morality of the state imposed justice and the I forget what you called it, like the dues that you paid to society being different to the dues that you've paid to the state, and how those are not concurrent, and all sorts of other things.
Yeah.
That discussion around that. So I do recommend, if anyone wants to see more in depth, it's hard to gloss over that whole, what was it, eight years from then till now. But the more in-depth conversation is there.
Well, it's really interesting because if people do watch that, our first conversation, I didn't make predictions, but I talked about how there is different elements of rehabilitation, and there's social rehabilitation and moral rehabilitation in the community. And I talked about how those are different things, and that the fact that I had served my time and even made progress towards repaying victims of my offending, that's not the whole story. And there are people out there who haven't received any money from repayments yet, because there's a list of people who are receiving it in order. So they haven't personally received any repayments yet. And to those people, I'm still the person I was when they last knew me in 2015 when I harmed them. And it's not just the financial harm, it's also harming their ability to trust and their ability to rely on people doing what they said they would do. And so for many people, that's where my story sort of ended, or that's where they last saw me. And that's been pretty relevant in the last few weeks with my candidacy being announced, because I have, I suppose, put my head out of the trench and put my hand up to seek public office. And that does put more of a spotlight on me and stirs up a lot of those past things for particularly the communities of Geelong and Colac, which were the most sort of the closest to what happened. And so in the last week, so this time last week, there was a story in the Geelong Advertiser, and that was followed during the week by a story in the Colac Herald. So the interest and the, I suppose, unfinished business of what happened then will continue to be a part of the story of my campaign, but certainly early on will be one of the first things that I address to those communities and to the community more broadly, because the question that flows from them is what has happened since, who are you now, and can we trust you, and can we trust you with our vote to represent us in Canberra? So that's a pretty important question to answer. And so that's what I've been doing over the past 2 weeks, and I'd expect that I'll sort of continue to have those conversations. But looking back at that conversation we had, it is definitely a good primer for what's happened more recently, but it also, I think, has been borne out.
Yeah, and I mean, even given the fact that so early there has already been media attention circulating around you for the fact that you are running for Senate, I think it's fair to say that we're likely to see more of that media coming forward. So we'll see how various organizations, various parts try to paint or try to interpret the story. But yeah, just know that this is probably not the last that we'll be seeing, or certainly I hope not the last that we'll be seeing of that, and how we frame it is to be seen from here on out. I did want to, so I mean, apart from the past, there's you're an incredible brain when it comes to digging into libertarian takes on recent topics. I mean, the last time we talked about the misinformation, disinformation ACMA bill, and how essentially the government is mobilizing towards censorship on social media, and uh, that was a bipartisan move that both sides, and there was no real opposition to it. And in fact, the opposition to that misinformation, disinformation bill came, I think, after we actually released the episode, where there was a huge backlash from the public, both from libertarian members of the public, but also the broader public against that bill for what it was trying to do. And it seems that this notion of censoring speech is not going away. It's something that's very much staying with us, and not just us. I think I see it internationally as well. So most recently, the story comes around, and it focuses in on Twitter specifically, and on Elon Musk, and on the stabbing of Maria Emanuel, the bishop of the Eastern Orthodox Church in New South Wales. So first of all, for anyone who's not familiar with the story and what's happening, do you mind giving us a rundown of that, and then I'll pick apart some questions going from there.
Yeah, so a couple of weeks ago, now there was two incidents in Sydney. There was one incident which was a series of stabbings. It was a bit of a rampage, I suppose you could call it, by someone that we now know was very unwell and had a schizophrenic psychotic break. There was lots of speculation around what his identity might be or what might have motivated him, things like that. And I think it's a great example of why it's very, very bad judgment to rush to decisions and to impose what you think or fear might be happening onto a situation before you really know what's going on. And then the second thing, which happened quite closely after that, and it's still being ascertained whether it was actually influenced by it as some kind of copycat incident, or what the motivation for the second incident was. But the second incident saw the stabbing of an Assyrian, a Christian Assyrian priest at his congregation. He frequently live streams, and during this live stream, he was approached from the front with the assailant sort of back to the camera and stabbed. So that was the incident that happened, and because of the nature of being live streamed, that footage was captured and circulated very widely within Australia and around the globe. And in the aftermath of that incident, X, so presume this is the thing, we only know that X received this request because they fought it and made it public that it had been made. We can only assume that Facebook, Instagram, and others were approached and said nothing and simply complied. And that's something we've seen play out through COVID as well. Until it gets to an organization like X or Rumble or Telegram who says no, we would never have known that this approach was made, because this notice wouldn't have been public. But the e-safety commissioner, using the powers given to them under the Online Safety Act 2021, has basically issued what's called an enforcement order, or it's like a takedown notice against X to remove that video from their platform. Now, faced with that order, X, not actually Elon Musk himself making the decision, but X's team chose to comply with the order, even though they disagreed with the ability of the safety commissioner to make it, and they flagged that they'd be fighting that in Australian court. They took down the ability of Australian users to access that video within Australia. What they were then faced with was the e-safety commissioner saying, no, that's not good enough. Because of the existence of VPNs, because our censorship regime can't actually stop Australians from accessing the global internet, unfortunately. She would love it to be like the dark picture of North Korea versus South Korea all lit up. Because our regime is impotent, we actually want you, X, to take down this video globally, to prevent anyone anywhere in the world using the internet from seeing this video. And that was what this whole fight became about, was not just the demand by the e-safety commissioner that they do something within Australia's jurisdiction, which, even though X disagreed they could do that, they said, yep, fair enough, in the interim we will do that. But this kind of really spectacular claim to have jurisdiction over the worldwide internet. And yeah,
Yeah,
I think
it's just
that leads
incredible.
to, like, if that were to be the case and that were to be established as legal precedent, can you imagine like North Korea, or can you imagine like Russia or anyone else saying, Australia, you need to take down content that was aired in Australia, not just within Russia, but Putin saying, no, this footage you put of the Ukraine war, I demand you take that down because our law says so. It's so clearly outrageous and indefensible and bizarre that it just boggles the mind that it even got as far as it has. But it did, and Elon said, no, we're not going to do that. And so what then ensued was this just frenzied wailing and hand wringing, and we're being bullied by a billionaire. And what we saw was very quickly not just Albanese and the Labor government falling behind support for the E-Safety Commissioner and her actions, but Peter Dutton last week appeared on the Insiders program on Sunday on ABC and said, "This is bipartisan policy. Not only do we agree, but we would call for tougher powers that the E-Safety Commission should have." And I watched that footage and my jaw hit the ground. Like, I was like, how could you read the room so badly? And the only conclusion I could reach was that he either hadn't asked anyone younger than 40 what they thought about internet censorship, or they just are that arrogant that they think they don't have to care. And like, I've spoken to people in the week since. I've got a broad range of friends across the political spectrum. Just yesterday, I spoke with someone who is an avowed lefty, in their own words, that they are, adjacent to the socialist movement, and they said this is crazy. They were totally aghast and opposed to what Albanese is doing. So I just think it's a massive, massive misstep. I think it cuts across the political divide based on age demographic, based on an understanding of how the internet works. But most of all, it's yet another example. And the ACMA episode we did talked about how the misinformation, disinformation bill was proposed by the Liberals, put forward by Labor. This is a bipartisan, or we would say unipartisan. This is uncontested between the major parties, that they believe that they should be responsible for what is on the internet, and at the end of the day, that they should be protecting adult Australians from distressing content. And that is the most bizarre, indefensible take that I couldn't disagree with more. As libertarians, we believe that it's up to the individual and the family to decide what they want to see, or in the case of families, to restrict or guide or supervise what their children see. And there's just no role for government in that. There can't be. And we say that the E-Safety Commission can't be fixed. It can't be made good. It is inevitable and will always be the case that if an agency like this is given a $45 million budget and 150 staff, it is going to suffer from mission creep at best. If we're being kind, we'll say, okay, mission creep. At worst, it's going to turn into the cultural police. And that's what has happened. And there's no way to fix it. So we are saying abolish it, save some money in the budget for good measure, and let individuals and families decide what should be seen on the internet by them and their families.
I find like it's incredible. It's really incredible when you think about, like, it's not just the nanny state. It's not like, a nanny over one house, a nanny who no one has asked for coming into a household and imposing rules. It's like that same nanny is now trying to impose the rules on the whole block, and still no one has asked for this nanny at all. For us to ask, a not Australian company on the internet to not show something because of the fear that maybe Australians can't see it, and therefore the whole world can't see this thing that we have, like, unequivocally not a scrap of jurisdiction on, is incredible. It shows a complete, like, detachment from reality, almost, is how I would describe it. So my question is, like, these people who have made this call and who are now backing this, is it do they genuinely not see the incredible stupidity of the thing they're requesting? Do you think they see it and it's a move to try and encroach, or it's some kind of trying to, like, a spectacle or something? Or are they genuinely that stupid that they do not see the implication of what they are asking?
No, I think they do see. And I think that like normally I'm a believer that most things can be explained by incompetence. Obviously, incompetence at a certain level is indistinguishable from malice, and it shouldn't be forgiven. But I'm normally the sort of person to say, look, I think this is just incompetence, or this is just failing to read the room. With this, though, with the whole disinformation, misinformation, narrative control that's playing out across a couple of different arenas, not just in Australia, but around the world, mind you, in the UK, in the EU, in Canada, we've seen this kind of, I suppose, policy thrust or direction. Really, at the same time, Australia is the smallest of those jurisdictions, but it is the easiest to actually implement these things because we have no real protections when it comes to human rights, like the EU and the UK do, or like the American Bill of Rights. We are essentially a jurisdiction where if a government can pass something, then it is legal. And as a result of that, we see often Australia being the canary in the coal mine for these issues, and Australia being a petri dish or a testing ground for these kind of, look, I'm just going to say globalist ideas that are antithetical to private enterprise, that are antithetical to individuals and families and communities making decisions. It's basically an agenda that is being set that is in large part a response to fear of losing control of the narrative. And you know, it's impossible to separate out conversation of this from the fact that the World Economic Forum, they nominated as their greatest risk, the biggest threat to humanity in 2024, according to the WEF, was disinformation. That's in their report. They've said that squarely and plainly. And then at the same time, we have governments all around the world using pretexts as they come up, which I think is what has happened here. I think that you can see after the referendum, the no vote resoundingly succeeded. The day after, and I predicted that this would happen, the day after, Anthony Albanese was saying this is a reason we need misinformation and disinformation controls. Nobody could have voted against this proposal unless they were misinformed by bad actors. And this is just, I think, a very cynical response. It's an opportunistic response, and they're basically trying to continue to litigate this. They're trying to, you can see in their messaging, they're trying to use Elon as this kind of scapegoat, as in like, oh, look, this big bad billionaire, he's thumbing his nose at us and defying us. Why does he want your children to see child pornography? That's kind of what this messaging has morphed into, which is bizarre because that's not even the issue being litigated. But I think it is very cynical, and I think it's clearly a bipartisan project. And in between Sunday last week and now, Peter Dutton has now backtracked and said, oh no, it's silly to try to enforce that across the world. But that I give him no credit for whatsoever. He has been hemorrhaging supporters and members of the Liberal Party. Just a brief sort of a scanning of the feedback and the comments on social media and on every possible public forum in response to his decision has been dismay and outrage. Conservatives, classical liberals alike, libertarians, the left, everybody has turned on this bipartisan position, and Peter Dutton now has tried to backtrack from that and tried to create some daylight between him and the Labor government, but he hasn't done that on the domestic front at all. He hasn't walked back from his position that e-safety is a bipartisan approach here in Australia, and he's just basically sort of walked away from the worst excess of the global claim. And I think that also says something about the advice he's received as well, because that still has to be tested in court. There's an interim injunction that the government's won, and people are going like, oh, look, you know, they've told him to take the stuff down. The way injunctions work is it's preserving the status quo. So it's basically saying, if we didn't grant this, would that have the effect of essentially nullifying the point? Like, so the courts go, okay, for the sake of the argument, let's say you can do this. If we say you can't now in this injunction stage, then we might as well just not rule on the question at all, because the video is going to be out there for however many months it takes to sort out the legal question. So the courts always err on the side of what does each party have to lose when they're making very early injunctions like that. But the newspapers are basically saying, oh, X ordered to take it down, as if that's the final argument. I would be willing to bet that we might never hear anything about the outcome of that court case, because it might be quietly dropped or settled, or you know, I think that Dutton's position of saying, oh no, we can't enforce it globally, probably said a little bit about some of the advice he might have received on the side about that as well. And it will be very interesting to see if that does end up getting ruled on. I think the government would much rather crab walk away from it than have ruling on their ability to do that. I think they'd much rather leave that ambiguous. But you're right, it's the whole situation is the most bizarre example of government overreach and bipartisan government overreach that I can remember seeing.
So for most people, I don't know most people, but a lot of people, I think this is probably the first time they've ever heard of like the e-safety commissioner, or if it's not the first time they've heard of them, it's the first time they've heard of them doing something so major. And so it stems from the Online Safety Act, and they used to be called the Children's E-Safety Commissioners, if that's right, which
That
sounds
is
like
correct.
playing on feelings,
Yeah,
if I'm
yeah.
not mistaken.
Yes, correct.
So where does this all stem from? This Online Safety Act, the Children's E-Safety Commissioner. Where do they come from? What is their mandate? Where do they get their powers? Who put them there? Who decided we needed one? What's the story?
So basically, back in 2015, this bill called Enhancing Online Safety for Children was proposed in 2015. And in 2015, David Lionhelm, who you just interviewed, was in the Senate. So we had a presence in the Senate. And I had a bit of a chat with him over the last 24 hours about what he remembers about that bill being proposed and what the sort of thoughts on it were and all that sort of thing. And he basically said nobody opposed it because it was to do with safety for children. And, so that's including One Nation, that's including our party. Everyone said, you know what? Maybe there are some things online that there should be some protections in place for children around. So they've used this enhancing online safety for children to establish a framework, to establish a commissioner. And then in 2021, they passed the Online Safety Act, which, with the stroke of a pen, changed it from the Children's E-Safety Commission to the E-Safety Commission. And what I would say is that effectively meant that from that point onwards, the government viewed us all as children in need of protection and supervision. It's a subtle change in language, but it's saying, no, the regime we had to protect children now will be applied to distressing content for adults. And so suddenly you had this framework that you couldn't argue against from first principles because there was already a commission in place. And if we think about what was happening in 2021 with respect to distressing content for adults and misinformation, disinformation, and these kinds of things, it's pretty clear to see what this was a response to. And so even as someone very interested in politics, my focus was primarily on the ACMA misinformation, disinformation bill. But as I was talking about that and going out and making the case against that, I was having a lot of people messaging me saying, hey, really, it's great. You're here and it's great. We're talking about this, but this fight has been ongoing and it's already the hour is later than sort of thing. And they were mentioning the E-Safety Commissioner. And so it was sort of on my radar, although I didn't realize the scope of the powers they have. And I didn't anticipate that it would go this. It's almost as though the powers the E-Safety Commissioner already has are a version of what they would like to have social media be forced to impose with ACMA, misinformation, disinformation. It's like they can use these powers directly through the E-Safety Commissioner, but they prefer not to because of the consequence of blowback like they've had. But it's almost like the failure of the misinformation, disinformation bill, or the sort of pushing back of it and the voice referendum and all these kinds of things has forced them to sort of lean on the E-Safety Commissioner to do the work they were hoping to do by this other mechanism. And something that a lot of people have missed in this that I just wanted to highlight as well, the E-Safety Commissioner talks all the time in the media about how she's an independent regulator, all this sort of thing. All that means is she isn't directly under a minister or taking instructions from a minister. In the wake of these Sydney stabbings that happened, Anthony Albanese told the media, I went to the E-Safety Commissioner and I told her this is something we need to do something about. And she did. And their budget has been quadrupled. So it went from something like 10, 12 million to 45 million plus. They've got up to 164 staff as their approved footprint in the budgetary estimates. And they have just been turned into this sort of Frankenstein's monster now that has sort of almost gained on a life of its own. And for her to sort of try to paint herself as independent of the government, I think is really disingenuous because it's very clear that that the E-Safety Commission is taking instruction or taking direction about what to focus on from the government.
Which is incredible when you think about the fact that, right now we're cost of living, inflation through the roof, recession looming, if not already upon us. Like the government is in many sectors actually shrinking and trying to tighten purse strings, even a Labor government, considering the fact that the public sector, considering the fact that there is so much debt and all the rest of it. And still,
in Victoria, they are. Federally, I would say that's definitely not the case.
Right. Okay. But so even still federally, they are expanding with something as vital as the e-safety commissioner. Something well, we were talking about it before, the fact that there is a global trend toward this sort of censorship, and a lot of it seems to stem from the fact that, well, during COVID and during also previously during the Trump's first election, there was kind of this increase in sentiment, an increase in feeling that people were making the wrong choice because they were being influenced by things on social media or on the internet that they could find that were
By
not
people
part
like
of
you,
the
Pietro, by
people.
podcasts
Yes,
like Collectivitis.
heathens like us, that part of not part of the allowable opinion and the allowable discussion. And it seems like the various steps towards censorship jump in increments, and the frightening thing about these increments is that they do seem to happen in lockstep worldwide. And I know there's lots of, conspiracy theorists and what the rest of it, and there's a lot of fear of, like, globalist agendas and the WEF, and there's a lot of fear of that kind of thing. Um, and it's difficult to sort of make a head of a tail or a tail of it, especially when they do seem to happen in lockstep, a lot of these things, and not just the censorship. There's lots of other stuff. With COVID, it was very clear that a lot of the rules and a lot of the allowable discussion in lockstep opened up and closed down. Um, I know it's a bit of a broad question, but I sort of wonder what your thoughts are on all of that, whether there is any merit to the kind of conspiratorial element to all of that, and why you think that sort of thing happens.
Yeah, that's a really great question. And I think it is something I'm really keen to explore as the campaign goes on, because it is not conspiratorial to say that there are vested interests, be they corporate, be they government, often a combination of both. And the World Economic Forum is a combination of both. It is a classically corporatist, I would say fascist organization, where it's the fusion of state and corporations. And these sort of powers that be, so to speak, have traditionally held a huge amount of power over global narratives. So things like the World Bank, things like the World Economic Forum, things like the World Health Organization, they are entities that are very used to being able to, even to nation states, kind of set an agenda and communicate and control a narrative, because they've been able to do so to nation states, who then have typically kind of fairly compliant or reliant mainstream media, no longer the fourth estate, certainly. And I think, just as an example of this, if you look at the World Health Organization at the moment, I'm about to do sort of a bit of a deep dive into this on my socials as a bit of an explainer. The World Health Organization is about a month away from voting on something called the Pandemic Preparedness Treaty. And that Pandemic Preparedness Treaty is a direct response to the way that the response to COVID happened worldwide. And they want to fix what they saw as some problems with the COVID response. Now, those problems definitely aren't what we would say the problems are. The problems they're talking about are problems in partly in equity in poorer countries getting access to vaccines and so forth before richer countries, but also squarely looking at this misinformation, disinformation thing. There's an article in the Pandemic Preparedness Treaty, which is all about pandemics and response to pandemics, nothing to do with misinformation, disinformation on the title. But in this treaty, there is a dedicated article talking about misinformation, disinformation, and it is exactly what the ACMA bill sought to do, almost word for word. So, and this is a global treaty that is going to become essentially global health policy if it's enacted from a nation state level. So these ideas are the ideas of a pretty homogenous shared value, shared network. A lot of it's informal networks and knowledge and sort of connections with each other. It's not necessarily true to say that it's a shadowy cabal in the sense that it's sometimes talked about, but it's just human nature. These people are what they would call thought leaders or business leaders. They're people that operate in a bubble. They have a shared view because they are people who have been able to co-opt global trends, technology, because they've got the power to control agendas and they've got the power to be ahead of trends. That's what's allowed them to become the global elite and to entrench and maintain that position. But the rise of independent media, the rise of alternative narratives and awareness of this kind of elite group is a direct threat to their ability to continue to do what they have done. So I think, in summary, it is definitely true that there is a pre-existing group of business and political elites who know each other very well, who share values, who have a shared worldview that comes from a very particular bubble that they occupy, and a privileged bubble that they occupy. So they can talk about things like, we need to be net zero, we need to be eating bugs, doing all these things to sort of, save the planet. But they are the people who are flying around in jets to visit each other and talk about these things, which runs completely counter to the actual logic of what they're talking about. So they are people seeking to make decisions for the world who are the least impacted by those decisions. So I hope that kind of answers your question. I do accept that I think these things do emanate from a sort of core elite of institutions and people and networks that are connected with each other. I'm going to explain and unpack that a bit more with the Pandemic Preparedness Treaty. But one final thing I just wanted to say on this topic, and something that kind of gets thrown around a lot, it's something people say about libertarians rather than something libertarians say. A lot of people say, oh, libertarians are globalists. They're, for open borders and all this other stuff. Globalization is a concept, is a word that is an inherent good for all citizens of all countries everywhere. It's a word that means freer trade. It's a word that means greater power, and both purchasing power, information power, power to move, to visit, travel. Globalization is a trend that is an inherent good in the sense that it makes individuals far less reliant on the state and far more sovereign. So globalization is a trend that I believe is absolutely good and libertarians do support. And it's a mix of technological advances and things that really empower individuals. But globalism, as a response to globalization, is a counter movement. It is a reactive response from an elite that pre-globalization were able to control trade, were able to control information flows, were able to essentially have the world to themselves, almost literally. And the rise of the sovereign individual and the rise of the power of people, which it's much harder to co-opt people than a nation state. Back in the day, if you just wanted something to happen in Australia, you just go, hey, Australian government, do this. Now, it is much harder to do that. And that's what they learned through COVID. That's what really shocked them, is there was a huge worldwide government-forced push to do a particular thing, whether it be to take a vaccine or whether it be to, think a particular thing about the source of COVID or whatever else it was. It was just a sound and fury, full force of not just each nation state, but the global world order. And even in the face of all that, a fairly large, between 5 to 10% of the population resisted it. And that is a percentage that is far, far too high for these people. So globalism and the global elite's response to the very positive trend of globalization is to try to capture and reroute it. So I know that's kind of getting into the weeds a little bit, but I think it's really important because what they're responding to is a good thing that is happening. But the response they're proposing, they're trying to enforce, is something that all free people everywhere should be fighting against.
Yeah, I mean, if it all wasn't so difficult enough for individuals to wrap their heads around, to have the two opposite ends of the spectrum, be globalism and globalization, there could not be too closer words. And
yeah, and it's not coincidental that they've chosen language that sort of co-opts the trend that was already happening. But they've done this many times before, and I think it's our obligation as libertarians and as people who want a freer society, who want more powerful individuals, and who want to protect people's right to make decisions in their own lives. Like, as we've talked about, Klaus Schwab from the WEF, he said that the biggest enemy to the globalist agenda, to the system they want to create, is libertarianism, that it's an anti-system. And he said, libertarians want to remove government influence from every sphere of private life. Like we're like, correct. That's exactly right. So our enemies understand we are the biggest threat to them. He didn't name Pauline Hanson's One Nation. He didn't name the Liberal Party or Labor Party, because ultimately those people think the system can be made good and can be sort of used for their own purposes. But we know that's not true.
Yeah, that was the most glowing endorsement of libertarianism that I think he could have possibly given. That was great. So I mean I'm with you. I think so let's take that. Let's assume that so the elites that we just talked about, the globalists who have a kind of very cynical greed, and that's their motivating factor for why they co-opt and they organize and they control various spheres. They're on that tier, right? But the tier below them, or a couple of tiers below them, are the actual legislators, who are the people such as the E-Safety Commissioner, who are enforcing these things on us here in Australia and everywhere else that they're going to eventually, or are starting to force these censorships on. So I guess it's we've delved into the philosophical, so let's stay in the philosophical a little bit longer. I think, as you know, I've been rereading The Law by Frederick Bastiat, and the major push of his major thesis in The Law is this idea that the only way the law can be just is if it is used only to serve the purpose of protecting individuals' life, liberty, and property. And as soon as various groups use the law to provide something for free to a certain group, or to promote a certain area of business, or whatever it may be, the law becomes perverted. And at this point, it's impossible to distinguish what is just from what is unjust, because we as people are taught from an extremely young age that the law is the right thing to do, right? You follow the law because that is what's correct. But if the law itself has become perverted to a way that serves nefarious ends for certain people and benefits certain people and whatnot, we can't tell who's morally good and who morally isn't. Someone who is, in their heart conscientious and morally good could be doing very evil things by virtue of the fact that they believe that the law is true and just. This is a very long-winded way of getting to my philosophical question: is these people, so these legislators, these people in charge, these the ones who are pushing, the ones who we see, the ones whose faces we see, who are pushing these things and who are saying the horrible things about Elon Musk and all the rest of us and telling us that they need to protect us. Do you think they are coming from a place of genuinely believing that they are saving the world and that they are doing a good for humanity? Or do you think it's something they themselves are nefarious and know that they're pushing an agenda that is malicious?
I think even if you look at the first tier we talked about with the globalist elite, they often are fervent believers in the rightness of their cause. Like the most dangerous of them, I think, are not the greedy, cynical ones that are sort of just mouthing and going through the motions and saying, "Oh yes, we're going to save the world," and quietly pocketing the money. The most dangerous of them, as in all things, are the true believers and the zealots who believe that they're so convinced in the rightness of their cause that they're prepared to sacrifice global prosperity, literally. And I think that the same is true of every level of this. I think it's true of politicians. I think it's true of supporters of political parties who have these policies. And certainly, people like, first name escapes me, but Coleman MP, who was one of the first to come out supporting the E-Safety Commissioner's actions. They're also NPC that I can never remember the first name, but this Liberal Party politician, he basically made this statement and he said, "Oh yes, we believe in free speech in the Liberal Party, but free speech is a privilege that has to be earned, and that you can, you know, uh, do the wrong thing and it gets taken away from you." And that betrays a thinking that is so different to what Bastiat talked about and to what we are coming from, where rights are something that people have. They're either God-given or they're inherent and natural, and the government can't grant them. You can't give somebody the right to freedom of speech. The right to freedom of speech exists and should only be limited by a conflict of rights between two people, not by the government imposing a checklist of things you have to do before you can exercise it. That's not a right, it's a privilege. And that's how he described it. He literally used the word free speech as a privilege. And that is the fundamental difference between us and the major parties.
I could go deeper, but let's veer away from the e-safety and misinformation stuff for a little bit, because I did want to talk a little bit about your campaign before we finish up. So for anyone who's, I mean, I hope that the conversation thus far has convinced many people that if they weren't already on board with the Libertarian Party is not only the best choice, but also has the best understanding of what the problems actually are at their core. Because I feel like a lot of the other alternatives, such as you mentioned, One Nation or the Liberal Party or whoever other minor parties may be, they sometimes poke and prod at the symptoms more than understanding what the core issue is. So if, I mean, keep following Jordan. I would encourage you, and you'll see that uh, libertarians do understand the core of the issues much more, in a much more real sense. And that's what we actually need to that's the platform that actually needs to gain more of a voice. Uh, so tell us a little bit about your campaign, how it started. First of all, I mean, the first question is another federal election. I mean, it feels like we just had one. When's this federal election? I haven't heard. If you haven't heard much about it yet, what's with the next federal election? When is it? What's happening?
Yeah, so it's a bit different to state elections where we're used to consistency, or council elections where we know when it's going to be. The truth is that when the next federal election is, only one person knows if he's made that decision yet. It's possible he hasn't made that decision yet, but Anthony Albanese, as the leader of the government, the party that holds the majority in the lower house federally, he will have a fairly wide range of options when it comes to when the vote is.
Which sounds pretty dictatorial.
Well, look, it's discretion. It's a discretionary power that the government has. That there's fairly complex Byzantine rules that govern both houses of government when their elections can be held. But what normally happens is that both half of the Senate and the whole of the lower house are elected at the same time. They go to the polls at the same time. And the range of dates that could be is between late August this year and late May next year. So if it was to be May next year, then that would be essentially a full 3-year term. That would basically be a full term of government. But it's possible that we could see an election as early as late September, early October, or November. Though that is certainly something that the government has within its power. And I believe it's something that they're very much keeping a live option. They're prepared for that, as are the Liberal Party. You can see the Liberal Party have endorsed their lead Senate team. They've endorsed candidates in key seats like Kooyong, Higgins, and others, especially where there are teal incumbents. And they're getting ready for the possibility of an early election. Now, what might trigger an early election? Anthony Albanese might get a bounce in the polls following the federal budget. I don't think he will, but it might. Dutton might make a big misstep and blunder very badly on something other than something the Labor Party also agree with. So, he might blunder on something the Labor Party actually disagree with him on. They tend to forgive blunders when it's on a bipartisan. And just this is just something that all of your listeners, if you're watching this podcast, you're probably more interested in politics than the average person, but many people are still learning about politics and are still coming to politics. The truth is that, especially federally, about 80% of things are not in dispute between the major parties. The business of federal government and federal parliament is quite mundane a lot of the time. We only see the tip of the iceberg when we see things in the news about differences in opinion and things where there are disagreements. But the work of the federal government, the state, we would call it, not state governments, but the state, the apparatus of federal government, is very, very mundane and very, in agreement most of the time. So look, I still think that a 2025 election is more likely, but my campaign will be very much preparing for the earliest possible election, because that way we're ready for the early election if it comes, and then everything after that, if it doesn't come, is additional time we can be talking to voters, raising funds for the campaign, and making sure that we get Libertarian voice back in the Senate.
And what do they have to give us of notice? There's like a fixed amount of time that they have to give of notice prior to it actually being. So when will we know if it is in September, for example?
So if it was going to be in the first possible date it could be, I was looking at this, as you can imagine, it's sort of been on my mind, like in my thoughts, I'm sort of thinking about this a lot. If it was to be the earliest possible date it could be, then it would be late June, early July that we would know that there would be steps. It would have to be the Parliament would expire, the Parliament would be declared at an end. Then there's a period of writs and a period of interactions with the AEC and electoral law and things like that. So all these things take time. It's not as though they can just go, okay, we're on in 6 weeks. There's a sort of a lead time that's about 2 months from start to finish. So, and usually before that, you'll get a fair sense, because even if the government doesn't say they're entering into an election mode, you'll often have a soft election period well before, suddenly I'm hearing from the government a lot about these things. Suddenly they're talking a bit differently. Suddenly I'm hearing ads on the radio and all these things. They're not meant to do that, but of course they do. And we've got to remember that we've got the May budget. So in about 4 weeks' time, 3 or 4 weeks' time, we've got the federal budget. They'll be basically announcing a whole bunch of things. And usually they want time for those announcements to percolate down through the various ministries and all that sort of thing. So that's why I say if it was to be early would probably be late September, early October. And that's the date I'm working back from. And the date we want to have everything ready for election day. And then every day we get after that is a gift that I'll seek to make maximum use of.
If anyone, well, I think a lot of people watching the show have probably figured out that, you're well spoken and you know your stuff. But what they might not know is that you're actually you basically don't sleep. You're one of the most active and energetic campaigners, even when you're not on campaign. So I don't know exactly what you're going to be doing, but I know for a fact you'll be doing lots of campaigning stuff in the coming months or many months. So if anyone, for people who are interested in coming along to some of your campaign stuff, what kind of things have you got planned? What kind of things have you got fixed? What's coming up in your campaign?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the first phase of the campaign, if you want to call it that, has definitely been getting around to our local branches within the Libertarian Party, activating our base, communicating to people that the federal election has now started as far as our party is concerned. And that's a big advantage. You mentioned earlier that it's unusual to have a Senate campaign begin this early and to have a lead Senate candidate for a winnable spot endorsed. One of the reasons our party has done that is because we see and recognise how important it is to be having conversations with the electorate before election day. Because at that point, everyone knows you're just trying to get their vote. The time to win people over and to communicate what our ideas are and who we are is in between elections, not once the election campaign begins. So the first stage of things is going to be definitely getting around to the branches, energising the people who already support and know about us. And the other reason for that is that we've got a very, very exciting development soon within the party in the next sort of 3 or 4 weeks. The branding exercise that we've been undergoing, we've been dealing with an external brand agency, not to reinvent the wheel in terms of who we are and what we believe. We're libertarians and our values and principles and our policies won't change, but things such as colour, logo, but more importantly than that, the way we're communicating to the electorate, how we talk about our values and ideas, and generally the sort of, I suppose, total brand footing that we're going to be taking to the federal election. That will be coming up in the next sort of little while. And so the last thing I want to do is go out and sort of start door knocking and start really getting out to the electorate and sort of promoting our party while we're just on the cusp of making a bit of a radical overhaul of how we do that. So I'm using this time before the rebrand is announced, which I'm really excited about as well. I have no idea what the options are that the party's come up with, but I know that the process has been robust and there's been a lot of hard work put in behind the scenes and a lot of consultation, both in focus groups and within the party. But once that next step is taken, then we shift to the next phase of the campaign, which will be getting out there, door knocking, letterboxing, doing listening posts, and you've referenced it before. Like, my strategy for the federal election campaign is going to be just to work tirelessly to weaponize work rate, to basically have as many conversations with ordinary people out there in the community as I can in between now and the next federal election. Twitter and social media are great sometimes for flying kites and sort of talking about things to people who are already interested in politics, but that's not the real world and that's not where most people live, and we've got to go and meet people where they live. And one thing I've found over my time in politics, and certainly since being in the Libertarian Party, is that when we can sit and have a human conversation with someone about our ideas, a surprising amount of people listen to our ideas and say, "Oh, yeah, that sounds like common sense," or "I really agree with that." There's a sort of an in-joke that everyone's libertarian on at least one issue. And I really do think that there's a silent sort of cultural majority within Australia that still believes in things that libertarian philosophy really resonates with. So I've identified that we really want to try to get 5 to 7% for the primary vote. That's a big increase from what we were able to achieve at the last federal election. And the way we're going to get there is wearing out multiple pairs of shoes in the literal sense of that. So yeah, I'm really excited by it because I'm a masochist and I don't value my free time. And but I'm hoping to get everyone else in the party and to get anyone else who's watching or listening or who engages with the campaign to get really excited about it. And we're going to be running a sort of a guerrilla insurgency campaign in between now and the next federal election and getting some really good momentum. So
And for anyone who's listening and who is interested in potentially having Jordan as a senator, you have to understand that 5 to 7% is an extremely difficult benchmark for us to hit. Like as a minor party that is averaging far lower than that in the previous election, like there needs to be a whole heap of work done. So if what you've heard here today is something that you are amenable towards, absolutely. I encourage that you volunteer and help and meet Jordan and assist in whatever way you can, because it's an uphill battle certainly to get a senator, because it is such a valuable position for us to have. So if someone is interested in assisting your campaign, have you got anything set up at the moment that they can sign up or donate or
yeah,
whatever to?
yeah, absolutely. If people want to find out what's been going on with the campaign, we've got all of the campaign socials on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook live and going. I'll give you those links and hopefully you can put them in the description for this episode. We've also got a Senate campaign page where people can subscribe to follow the campaign. We've got a campaign newsletter. We've got a blog. We've got the ability for people to donate and to volunteer, because sometimes your time and your expertise is the most valuable thing you can give the campaign. But yeah, this is going to be a real genuine grassroots campaign when we're sitting here after the federal election and hopefully, the Libertarian Party again has a representation in the Senate. We will have done that because we will have genuinely mobilized grassroots people in the community and built a movement and a momentum in between now and then, which I'm really looking forward to. So yeah, if you're listening to this and if you think you want to be involved in a pretty historic development in Australian politics, then I'd love to hear from you.
This podcast is starting to sound more like an advertisement. The one thing that I was thinking that's quite a weird phenomenon to do with especially Senate candidates, is that a lot of the time, like a Senate candidate for one of the majors, or even someone like a lower house candidate, often their job within the major party is kind of to be quiet, is to not rock the boat, because the Liberal Party gains all of its support from, whatever Peter Dutton is doing, whether he's doing well, or whatever the leaders are doing, or the perception of the party at large. And all that a Senate candidate or a lower house candidate can do really is screw it up. Like they're not going to, other than meeting people personally, but they're not trying to gain a lot of attention, try to be a spokesperson. Whereas for a minor party, it's the exact opposite. Like they have the bigger platform because the media is generally more interested in talking to a liberal or a major party. And we have the smaller platform, but have the most to say and do need to say the most. And I don't know, have you experienced that so far, or are you expecting to experience that?
I think there's always a barrier for so-called minor parties, and really there is no distinction in Australian politics between major and minor, except what people believe to be true. Like the major parties like to refer to other parties as minor parties, but in reality they're all registered Australian parties, and there's no distinction between them except that two of them are almost certain with our compulsory preferential form of voting in the lower house to win government. And what we aim to do as libertarians in particular is to make sure that whichever party is the ruling party of the day, be that Labor or be that Liberal, that they have a segment of at this stage, the crossbench in the Senate, but eventually one day in the lower house, we hope as well, that they have a segment of Parliament of each house who represents a segment of the Australian people who are going to be looking at what they're doing really critically and pushing back against the worst excesses, fighting for amendments and reforms, or even saying, hey, look, we don't really care about this issue, but if you want our support on it, here's something we really do care about, and we'd love for a law to be repealed instead of just passed once every so often. That'd be a pretty good outcome. So yeah, I do expect that we will have issues getting the recognition and momentum that major parties will, but that just means we have to be creative and clever and innovative. And as always with libertarianism, it's all about out competing. So
Yeah, free markets. We are almost at the hour mark there. Is there any last message before we go that you'd like to leave our viewers and listeners with?
Only to say that I think it's inevitable that my past is going to be interesting to the media. Sometimes that's what they're going to want to talk to me about potentially, and it's not always going to be in a positive way. There will be both media outlets and potentially other political parties who might view us as a threat or see we're getting momentum and want to go out of their way to stick a stick in our bike tire. But ultimately, those things will be opportunities for me to talk about who I am, where I've come from, and who I am now, and most importantly, to talk about our party and to talk about our ideas. So they say that the flak is heaviest over the drop zone, is the military saying, and I think 2024 is going to be a very interesting year.
Well, yeah, let's hope so. Or and 2025 potentially. All right. Well, thank you very much for your time, Jordan. All the very best on your campaign. For anyone who's interested, I will post all the links to Jordan's socials and everywhere else you can find him. For us, you can find us on Twitter, YouTube, Instagram, and Spotify. For now, that's it. Thank you very much for listening, and we will catch you next time.
See you, mate.